Protesters in the US demand a restoration of their constitutional right to privacy. What do the recent NSA spying revelations mean for American democracy? You're watching Inside Story Americas from Washington. Hello, I'm Shihab Ratansi. The disclosures by former US government contractor Edward Snowden have given the world a glimpse into the far-reaching spying capacity of the National Security Agency. Americans appear divided on whether the NSA is justified in collecting information on millions of citizens, including phone and internet data. But on this, the country's independence holiday, protesters are demanding that the government respect the constitutional guarantee against, quote, unreasonable searches and seizures. Members of Congress are also demanding answers into whether they were misled about the NSA's activities. Before the leaks, US officials, including the Director of National Intelligence, had assured members of Congress that the government was not collecting information on hundreds of millions of Americans. So what have we learned about the NSA over the last month? And joining us now, Nathan White. He's the national spokesperson for the Restore the Fourth rally. We also have Julian Sanchez, a research fellow at the Cato Institute who focuses on technology, privacy and politics. And Thomas Drake. He's a former NSA senior executive and also a whistleblower. More on that a bit later, but first of all, let's run through the revelations. So much information has been released over the last month. Much of it, though, has been rather overshadowed by the drama surrounding Edward Snowden himself. So let's bring us all up to date on more than a month of leaks now. First, on June the 5th, The Guardian reveals that the National Security Agency is collecting phone records on millions of Verizon customers in the US, mandated by a secret court order. The next day, we learned about a previously undisclosed program called PRISM. The program allows the NSA to gain direct access to the private communications of those who use large internet services, including Google, Facebook, Apple, and Microsoft, although all those companies have denied allowing direct access. Julian Sanchez, let's begin with that first of all. When we spoke, as these revelations were first breaking, there was a lot of carefully worded language, carefully worded denials. There were a lot of them sort of circulating. Those customers saying, we don't give anyone direct access. Perhaps, we certainly would conform to any court order that's given to us and we would act then within the law, but we're not allowing them to have a direct presence on our network. Have we ever got to the bottom of all this?
It's still not entirely clear how that works. Google has said that they use a dedicated secure FTP server to provide data that's been ordered by a court to be turned over. And at some level, the distinction between direct access and not direct access can be blurred at the limit. If there's mirroring of entire servers to an FTP sandbox to be downloaded, the difference between direct access and not having direct access wouldn't be that meaningful. Likely it's a smaller subset. And this is meaningful because there are certain kinds of disturbing searches that you can't do as easily without direct access. So for example, you wouldn't be able to do keyword searches across the entirety, let's say, of Gmail users without direct access. The question really ultimately is, how big is the sandbox that they're creating? Because that seems to be what's going on. There's a separate mirrored server, it sounds like, being created. And the question is whether it has a relatively small number of targeted accounts or whether, for example, they're filtering big ranges of accounts accessed from foreign IP addresses to be put into that sandbox.
But then in the last few days, though, the Washington Post released more of those PowerPoint slides, which suggested that there was a physical presence on the premises of participating companies, these data intercept units, DITUs, right, which again suggested that this was more than just mirroring, and this was actually a physical presence within the servers of these companies.
Well, it's not clear. I mean, they could have a machine that was getting a selected subset of the content on the premises. We know from the revelations of AT&T whistleblower Mark Klein that, for example, major telecoms like AT&T had split their fiber optic internet cables into secret rooms where sophisticated semantic analyzers processed that traffic, the entire traffic coming through those switches, to be filtered and some subset of it to be stored. We assume that they were recording fairly broadly a lot of that, so it seems like perhaps something similar is going on in the offices of these other companies. It may be more restricted in some way to try and limit it to foreign accounts.
There's still questions about that, exactly how it works at the very least. Let's move on with our timeline. On June the 8th, The Guardian reveals that the NSA has developed a tool known as Boundless Informant, which allows the agency to organize the data it collects from around the world, including that from the US. Thomas Drake, it's great to have you on, because in many ways you were one of the pioneers in developing the software to analyze, organize, index the information that was being swept up by the NSA. You blew the whistle because the NSA had decided on a method to do that, which is incredibly expensive and didn't, in your opinion, respect constitutional rights, constitutional privacy. How does Boundless Informant fit into that, into the pattern of surveillance that we've had, into the technology that's been used over many years, even when you were, since the pioneering days when you were working at the NSA?
Well, NSA was severely challenged in dealing with the digital age. They were simply ingesting vast amounts of data and had great difficulty figuring out what it meant. And so they began to develop global programs that would allow them to do so. Boundless Informant is simply, 12 plus years on, is a mechanism that allows how successful are they in being able to acquire the targeting information, or the collection information that they receive or acquire
Just
from
keeping a
these
tab
countries.
on things, really.
Keeping a tab, and it's really more of a chart, a green light, a red light chart that says how successful are they in their surveillance of the world.
So it's not the actual software that's doing the analysis.
That's
correct. Do we have much information about that then, and the extent? And clearly, again, to go back to your particular case, then you advocated one piece of software that would be cheaper and respect our constitutional rights. The NSA went with another that was much more expensive and didn't. Do we know what they are using then to do this analysis now?
Well, they went with there was an entirely different program, because Trailblazer ultimately never deployed anything. It never developed anything.
Right.
It spent a lot of money.
That was
the existing secret surveillance programs in which I was present at the beginning were called Stellar Wind, and that was the umbrella name for a series of secret surveillance programs that were extraordinarily broad in nature and essentially bulk data, telephone numbers, email addresses, as well as yet other electronic information was being provided to NSA on a very large scale, in the deepest of secrecy and bypassing the mechanism by which you could even acquire that in terms of target information, which was through the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court.
Right.
And that's why they bypassed it. They simply wanted access to all the data. They needed to hoard it in order to figure out what they had. And they didn't want any controls, they didn't want any protections, no safeguards at all.
And now we know, actually, in the last week or so, that Stellar Wind, that program did continue under President Obama until 2011.
There's a metadata component that started under Stellar Wind. It's not clear that it's still Stellar Wind as such. There's changes over time in how things were acquired. The FISA court was brought in, so things were being done subject to court order rather than presidential directive, which I suppose is an improvement of a sort, although it's not clear that substantively it changed the volume of information that was being collected.
Provided legal cover.
Right, exactly. And
legal does not mean constitutional.
Well, we'll return to that topic in a moment. Let's continue with our timeline. On June the 16th, it was revealed that the UK's government communications headquarters, which shares information with the NSA, intercepted foreign politicians' communications during the 2009 G20 summit. That simply gave us more of a sense of the axis of surveillance that exists around the world. Then, on June the 20th, top secret documents show that US judges signed off on broad court orders that allow the NSA to use information inadvertently, quotes, collected from domestic US communications without a warrant. Now, has that caused much concern? Has that caused much of a stir? What are the implications of that particular revelation, Thomas?
Well, from my perspective, under Section 02, it simply gives them a backdoor access. I mean, this is something I warned about even before these most recent revelations. So that you would actually have access, even under inadvertent in many respects, is just a catch-all, meaning it allows us to collect, even though we didn't mean to originally collect it, and then we can take a look at it later.
So even if the information on American citizens is collected supposedly inadvertently and therefore unconstitutionally, illegally, it's still admissible, it's still able to be used if they decide they want to look at it.
And the original idea here was not that crazy. It was that you would be doing surveillance subject to relatively specific individualized warrants. And so if you had probable cause to believe someone was a foreign agent, you were spying on them, and then in the course of that surveillance of that specific person, you picked up evidence that they were also engaged in, some other kind of crime, larceny, murder, as has happened. There was a Al-Qaeda agent under surveillance who then killed his daughter and was caught on tape and was prosecuted for that. And you think, well, that's reasonable enough. If you've got a specific warrant, they happen to also kill someone, you want that to be usable in court. But when the scale of this shifts, so it's not specific individuals under surveillance, but broad and programmatic surveillance that's sweeping in millions of communications every day, including communications with, to, and from Americans, the shape of that changes. It becomes much easier to say, since you've got all this data, let's apply analytics that will help us find domestic criminals in ways that circumvent the ordinary protections that are supposed to apply to criminal wiretaps.
But Thomas Drake, in your opinion, are those safeguards, though, in place? Even though that we have this enormous scale, we know now that so much information is being stored in vast computers in Utah or wherever. Are you convinced they will only be accessed through a court order?
Not at all. The court order is a rubber stamp. The court order gives them a veneer. In essence, you've turned the Fourth Amendment on its head. You seize first, you'll search later. The bottom line is they want the data because they might find something of value in it. So the inadvertency, well, it's convenient to pipe through everything else that you happen to come across.
Right. Okay. Well, we'll return.
So you lose the whole notion of individualized search. You lose the whole notion of probable cause. You now have the equivalent, for all intents and purposes, of a general warrant.
Right, and I suppose, that brings us to the Fourth Amendment pretty quickly there, I suppose. The argument is this isn't unreasonable search and seizure, or this isn't unreasonable seizure because they simply just happen to have this stuff on their computer, so they're not actually breaking in anywhere, and they just have this stuff, which they're not looking at. And if they do need to access this stuff, they have to go through a court whose deliberations may be secret, but there is supposedly some oversight. That's the logic anyway, isn't it? Yeah.
I think when we get into that level of detail, we forget that the vast majority of the country is shocked to learn this information, and some of it has come out earlier, but in this splashy way that has really made headlines. People are shocked. They did not think that this was possible because they thought we had constitutional protections over this. There's a way that you can argue around it where you can say that it's not an intercept. It's only defined as an intercept once somebody actually listens to it. There's all these details that you can get into, but for the vast majority of people, it's just shocking because it seems wrong.
All right. Well,
there's a sense in the country called fair play, and I think why we're having the discussion right now is because fair play is no longer fair.
We'll return to fair play in a second. Let's complete our timeline. On June 21st, The Guardian reveals the UK spy agency has been secretly tapping hundreds of fibre optic cables carrying phone and internet traffic and then sharing that information it obtains with the NSA. On June 27th, it was revealed that a program started under President Bush in 2001, allowing the NSA to collect vast amounts of email and internet usage records from Americans continued until 2011 under President Obama. We already alluded to that. And just this week, the German magazine Der Spiegel revealed that the NSA is spying on its European allies, including Germany, by bugging EU buildings and monitoring millions of communications. Is there anything we missed out there? Are those the main the main revelations? It has been difficult to keep track.
It says something when it's difficult for even us to keep track of.
So. All right.
And I believe it's only the tip of the iceberg. I think we are going to see and read about additional disclosures that are truly going to reveal the fuller extent
and certainly
of this vast Leviathan surveillance system.
And certainly we seem to have been promised more. But and all of this has drawn attention to the level of honesty with which government officials have been leveling with the American people and the rest of us and the world, really, at least publicly. And that brings us on to the Director of National Intelligence, James Clapper. At a congressional hearing on March the 12th, James Clapper said the NSA was not collecting data on Americans.
Does the NSA collect any type of data at all on millions or hundreds of millions of Americans?
No, sir.
It does not.
Not wittingly. There are cases where they could inadvertently, perhaps, collect, but not wittingly.
All right.
Now, following the leaks by Snowden, Clapper backpedaled.
I thought, though, in retrospect, I was asked, when are you going to stop beating your wife kind of question, which is meaning not answerable necessarily by a simple yes or no. So I responded in what I thought was the most truthful or least untruthful manner by saying no.
Now, Clapper has subsequently written a letter to the Senate Intelligence Committee to apologize. This is a portion of that letter. Faced with the challenge of trying to give an unclassified answer about our intelligence collection activities, many of which are classified, I simply didn't think of Section 215 of the Patriot Act. Instead, my answer addressed the collection of the content of communications. That said, I realized later that Senator Wyden was asking about Section 215 metadata collection rather than content collection. Thus, my response was clearly erroneous, for which I apologize. Now, lots of sniggering around the table, but what actually, what was he guilty of anything? There is a sense, though, that as far as that congressional hearing was concerned, Thomas Drake, publicly he was perhaps giving the least untrue answer, but he was then giving private answers to people in Congress about the scale of the collection. I suppose that's one of the arguments that they're using. So we are being served by our congressional watchdogs.
In part, but it's in secret. And Wyden has gone as close to the line as he can, that if Americans found out, even before all these recent disclosures, that they'd be angry and upset.
This is Senator Wyden who's on the Intelligence Committee.
That's correct.
Yeah.
Saying that least untruthful is an Orwellian phrase. It's still dissembling, and I believe he perjured himself in front of Congress.
You think the least untruthful answer would have in fact been the true answer, which was yes. The idea that he somehow had no idea what Wyden was talking about is ludicrous. He's been warned by Wyden before this hearing that he was going to ask this question. It was clear that Wyden had been disturbed by what we now know to have been this 215 metadata program. The idea that somehow he wasn't sure what he was being asked about is not credible. If you look at that video, you see the sort of the fidgeting with his head. It's what poker players call a tell. That is a man who knows he is lying.
And subsequently, though, we now go back in the records and we realize the NSA director, Keith Alexander, in March 2012 also basically denied that anything like PRISM was happening for Americans anyway.
I believe he committed perjury as well.
Is there any accountability underway there? Is this a big deal in the US? Perhaps our international viewers might want to know.
It's only a big deal if they don't get away with it. But what is the disincentive?
But is this causing a great stir? Are there calls, though, for his...
Well, I can jump in here. Yeah. We've asked for three things as part of Restore the Fourth. Yeah. And the first is that this is all declassified so that we can discuss it and so we can find out what is appropriate and we don't have to have experts confused by following it. The second thing is that we'd like to have an investigation. We think it's important that the government has fair play with the American people, and we need to know who made decisions, who answered questions, and under what authority they did that. And thirdly, we insist on accountability. We haven't specifically said certain individuals have broken the law and need to be held accountable because that's putting the cart before the horse. But clearly there's a need for an investigation, and we will insist on accountability.
So that's why, let's talk a little bit about Restore the Fourth then. You've had demonstrations across the country, but it's quite a wide coalition. It's not necessarily, we don't think this surveillance should be taking place. It does seem to be more, well, we just want to know what's going on. Would that be a correct way of...
Well, we represent a very diverse group of people, and the reason for that is that we are not on the left and we are not on the right. There is this concept of the left and the right and Occupy and Tea Party that is very separated. But the thing that holds us all together, that unites us as a country and gives us the framework for us to be successful, is the United States Constitution. The Fourth Amendment is part of the Bill of Rights of the United States Constitution. That's what's under threat here. The thing that holds us together with diverse opinions is under threat. And so there are people at our rallies that have dramatically different opinions about Edward Snowden and about particular politicians, but we're united in our concern that how can this be happening when it seems so on its face to be unconstitutional.
But the polls are interesting, though, and there have been a series of opinion polls since the NSA documents were released. The most recent, published on June 19th by the Washington Post and ABC News, it found that 58% support the NSA's intelligence gathering program. The same poll found that 65% support holding public hearings on the program. So that's more to your point, Nathan. Other polls have found varying levels of support for the surveillance. A CNN ORC poll released just a few days earlier asked respondents if they thought, quote, the Obama administration has gone too far in restricting people's civil liberties in order to fight terrorism. And 43% said he had gone too far, compared to 38% who said it was about right, and 17% who said it did not go far enough. One more, though, and the Gallup poll asked people whether they, quote, approve or disapprove, end quote, of the government's program of collecting phone records. And in that, though, with that wording, 53% said they disapprove. of the program. So it's an interesting selection of a certain amount of cognitive dissonance, perhaps.
Certainly, it's how you ask the question, but also let's go back to the beginning. The Patriot Act was not written as a specific legislative fix to make sure 9/11 would never happen again. It was a bunch of things that law enforcement had previously wanted, and it was passed almost immediately in a state of fear at a time when people have admitted we were taking the gloves off. We were going to go after the bad guys, whoever they were. There wasn't a discussion about this. We've reauthorized the Patriot Act 3 times since then, and each time Congress waits until essentially the last minute, has very little debate, and when there is debate, it's inside of Congress, and they always hide behind the secrecy of it's classified national security, be afraid. We as a nation, in more than 10 years since 9/11, have never had that conversation about where is the level? At what point does it become okay? You think the government didn't want to read the earliest forms of communication? New tools exist, and it's changing technology, and we as a nation haven't had a conversation about what is appropriate and what we're going to accept as a
President Obama says he
people.
welcomes the conversation, and this is what he said, actually. First of all, there is transparency because they do go through these courts, these FISA courts, these Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act courts. What do you make of that argument? I mean, and even then, even if the legal interpretations, I suppose the theory goes,
it's like
Julian,
getting caught cheating on your wife and saying, I'm glad we're debating whether or not we're monogamous.
Right, but even so, the point is though, there are legal interpretations. They may be secret legal interpretations, but there are legal interpretations that we. I mean, even saying it's
transparency to 11 people is not transparency. This is 11 judges, all at this point handpicked by Chief Justice John Roberts. All but one, I believe, Republicans, more than half former prosecutors, operating, again, in secret without the normal process of external reviews that disciplines judges.
What about congressional oversight, then, very quickly? We've only got a few minutes left there.
I can tell you, I used to work in Congress, and it is terrifying to be accused of being soft on terrorism. That is just killer to a member of Congress, to our Senate. And what we with Restore the Fourth want to do is make sure that they have that same equal, healthy fear of being soft on civil liberties.
All right, what about metadata isn't protected under the Fourth Amendment of unreasonable search and seizure because it's already in the hands of third parties? That's an argument.
Well, that's been an argument, and that's been an argument that says it's not communications, it falls under the Fourth Amendment. I believe it's still a violation, especially when you're trolling vast troves of it on a very large scale over time.
This is crazy. People use the internet to look at medical websites, pornographic websites, read controversial political opinions. People, yes, let their internet provider have logs of that data, but they expect that information will be private. I mean, no one would sign up for a broadband provider who said, by the way, we're going to publish the list of websites you're visiting.
Well, most importantly then, and this seems to have gained some traction amongst sections of the population, this kind of activity is keeping us safe has been a major argument.
Well, that's what they say, but we don't have a conversation, so we don't really know that. That it's trust us, but at the same time, don't pay attention when you catch us lying to you. That's why we need to have this conversation. I think it's helpful to look at what's going on in the private sector with these new tools for big data analysis. That people are concerned about this, and marketers have access to that information. So there's a conversation, a very open conversation in Congress about how we're going to deal with that, with do not track and what's appropriate to protect consumers. But when it comes to security in the state, we can't have that conversation because it's a cloak of secrecy. Trust us. This is for your own good. We can't tell you what we're doing.
And
very quickly.
Every time it's panned out false. The warrantless wiretap program under Bush was supposed to be saving lives. The Inspector General finds they can't actually point to any cases. Fusion centers were supposed to be a vital tool. Congress investigates. They've never produced any useful intelligence. In this case already, we've heard these claims about how these programs stopped a plan to bomb the New York Stock Exchange, and well, it must have been serious because the jury convicted them, except there was no jury trial, and in fact the prosecutors in that case said there was no specific plot. It was a material support case. There wasn't an active plot to bomb the New York Stock Exchange. All of these claims that have actually eventually come under scrutiny have not panned out. I think the time to go with trust us is far past.
Julian Sanchez, thank you very much. Thomas Drake, thank you. Nathan White, thank you as well. And that's it from the team in Washington, D.C. for now. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter and Facebook, where you can find more information about the program. And we want to hear from you. Share ideas with us on Twitter. Our handle is AJ Inside Story AM.